I'm still with Sharon Davis, Olympic legend, women's rights campaigner, of course. By the way, Sharon, before we get on to Boy George and JK Rowling, I was just discussing with my producer your extraordinary story about the kid in the... Is it your kids' class?
Yes. Well, no, it was a friend's. It was a friend's.
Okay, a friend
who came to me, because I get all these stories. Obviously, people are ringing me up and speaking to me all the time, stopping me in supermarkets and goodness knows what. I mean, I had a lovely lady stop me the other day in Lidl, and she came up to me. She had tears in her eyes, and she said, "I just want to say thank you." And obviously, I said, "Well, what for what you're doing?" And she said, "I was a care worker, and I'm not going to say exactly where, but it's not very far away from where I live." And she said, I was a care worker, and they brought a trans-identifying male in and the older ladies didn't want to obviously have intimate care by this person. And I had a problem with it, and I told them, and they sacked her. And she'd been a care worker all her life, and she was and I said, well, now why don't you, make a claim against them? And she just said, look, I'm old and I'm retired and I'm tired, and I have a heart condition. I'm just not going to do it. But I just needed to say thank you. And off we went into Lidl and did our shopping. And there's so many stories like that,
Sure. Well, I have a question, though, to you about your friend's kid in the litter tray. Does the kid who identifies as a cat, does he or she use the litter tray?
I don't know. I didn't actually ask that. I just know there was a litter tray in the back of the room, and that child had been done for scratching. Because and so other children were having to put up with being scratched in the class because this little girl identified as being a cat.
Unbelievable. Well, let's move on to JK Rowling, one of your fellow heroes, heroines, should say, I guess, in the campaign that was so triumphant last week with the Supreme Court's ruling. Boy George says that JK Rowling, because she continues with this campaign, must hate men. As I said in my monologue at the beginning of the show, well, at least she doesn't chain them to radiators and hit them with a blunt instrument like you did, George. But you must get this as well. Doesn't that annoy you that Boy George's interpretation of JK Rowling's heartfelt campaign that you've been such a part of as well, to get women's rights, biological sex ruling, he interprets this as she must hate men?
Isn't the irony of all of that recognising then that trans-identifying men, trans women, are men? I mean, that is literally what he's saying. That is the irony of the situation. And you were spot on. This is a man in 2009 that served 15 months for false imprisonment and assaulting a male escort. And also a man who spent most of his life with more makeup on than I've ever done in my life. And no one ever had a problem with it, did they? So there's so much there's irony amongst that. It's just ridiculous. JK's been very happily married for a long time. She absolutely doesn't hate men at all. She's just a women's rights campaigner, and we talk a lot about toilets, but actually the serious side of it is it's right crisis centres, it's hospitals, like you said, it's working rights, it's all the things that women have fought for decades to get put into law, and now what's also really very important because of that Supreme Court ruling or clarification was that our laws that were put into the Sex Discrimination Act of 1975 now really stand, whereas we were beginning to feel that was just literally wiped out, that meant nothing anymore.
Exactly. Now, Boy George says, stop this nonsense. If you don't agree with JK Rowling, you hate women. She hates men. This is where the truth lies. She cannot differentiate between a trans woman and a biological male, which is weird with her imagination. That is just arrant claptrap, isn't it? Absolute rubbish.
Yeah. And also what's also rather striking is in the early days, he was pro fair sport. So I know that I retweeted a couple of his tweets 8 years ago when actually he was saying that women's sport should be fair. So he's kind of changed because it's not the clever, woke, interesting thing to do. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what this problem is. It's become a bit of a fashionable thing to do, to jump on this bandwagon of pretending that biological sex doesn't actually exist.
Exactly right. Well, JK went on to hit back to George and say, I'm married to a man, George. I do not hate men. I simply live in reality where men, however they identify, commit 98% of sexual assaults and 88% of victims are female. female trans-identified men are no less likely than other kinds of men to pose a risk to women or girls, as you were saying earlier, Sharon.
Yeah, and actually, as I explained, there are bigger risk. Percentage-wise, the number of men that are in prison, is about 18-19% for men for sexual assault, and the number of men percentage-wise that are in prison who are trans-identifying is way up there in the high 60s, nearly 70%. So I mean, it's that's like nearly 3 times as much, right? That's 3 times as dangerous. So that's why we are genuinely scared by being in a confined space with these people. And then think about children. I mean, I have a real problem because UK Active gave advice to all the leisure centres and swimming pools and private clubs like David Lloyd's, and Virgin Active, to say that anyone should be able to identify into any changing that they feel most comfortable in. So literally you have people that would be rocking up that day going, right, today I identify as a woman, and going into a changing room and changing next to young girls. I've got a granddaughter, it's 5. I would not let it happen. I mean, I just would not. I would have smoke coming out my ears, So,
absolutely. Yeah.
But a lot of people wouldn't be necessarily quite so brave, and they just carry on.
And so are you saying, Sharon, then that, I mean, obviously these are going to be difficult months, probably years ahead, as we've discussed. More and more, or many organisations are going to rail against this. You know this. We've already seen evidence of it that we've been discussing in the past half an hour. Are you saying that you and your companions in your campaign are going to be very vigilant about this? You're going to launch as much... I don't think we have much of a choice, Kevin. I think that's the only way we can go now. The law is very much on our side, so therefore we have to actually call them out. And I will definitely be doing it in sport. So if people break the law after last week's Supreme Court ruling on biological sex, you and your fellow women's rights campaigners will sue. You will launch legal action.
Absolutely.
As much as possible.
I mean, if you think about the 4 women Scotland, which was the wonderful ladies from Scotland who brought the court case, to the Supreme Court, they had to raise about 400,000. So although JK gave them 70 grand, there was £400,000. That's £330,000 that had to be raised from women that were just putting their hands in their pockets and giving 10 quid. I gave 50 quid. I mean, I know loads of women that gave money. That money's all going to be returned to them, right? Because they get costs. So we are going to have that money available to us. And I'm thinking very strongly about setting up a foundation which will be strongly around sport, so that, people can donate to that, and we can just take them on, and we can turn around and go, no, we're going to protect them one sport at a time. But we saw Poole go this week. Poole have had to give in and protect their female athletes. I mean, how crazy was it that 2 weeks ago in the women's final of Ultimate Pool,
two men
in the final, and they won more prize money between them than the 14 women behind them. Right?
That's
and £48,000 has gone to men in women's pool in the last couple of years. I mean, it's just disgraceful. And in America, $1.6 million has gone to men in women's cycling. So, I mean, it's just disgraceful, especially when we get such a small slice of the cake, Kev. I mean, that's the thing which is really, really rubbing salt in the wounds. Women get about 4 or 5% of the sponsorship dollar across the world. In the world of sport, we represent half of the world, and we get 4 or 5% of the money. And we were told for the last 10 years we weren't even entitled to that.
It's not fair, and we've got to redress the balance. Can I just ask you, as we come towards the end of this great conversation, Sharon, Kemi Badenoch has announced that perhaps trans people should use disabled toilets. What do you make of that?
I just think we need to have discussions about third spaces. I'm not anti any of that. I want to try solutions that work for everybody. All I can tell you is when swimming, World Aquatics created a third category, which was a trans inclusion category, not a single athlete turned up.
Really?
Not one. And this was in Berlin a couple of years ago at a World Cup. And so I can tell you for a fact that those trans-identifying males, because it was males, right? Because the women carried on competing in the women's category, and nobody had a problem with it, providing they weren't taking testosterone. Those males didn't want to actually just be included. They wanted to win women's prizes because they had an advantage. So I think we might have the same problem with the toilet scenario. Creating neutral spaces isn't what they want. They want to come into our spaces.
So what you're saying, though, to reiterate, is you're going to pursue this aggressively to make sure the law is upheld in all areas.
Yeah, I think we have to. I mean, I've got a daughter that did sport, and I've now got a granddaughter, and I just think we have to make sure that they've got that opportunity. It's one of the most heartbreaking things that I've heard over the whole 10 years of fighting for this, since 2015 when the IOC changed the rules, without any consultation to female elite athletes whatsoever. Was this lady who actually spoke to me about her daughter, and the primary school had decided to do just non-gender racing all day long, because that way there wasn't any confusion and no one's feelings was going to get hurt. So they just had mixed races all day, and not one little girl had won a competition that day. Not one single race was won by a little girl on their primary school sports day. What message are we giving little girls? I
mean, that is the point, isn't it, Sharon? That if you and your fellow campaigners don't aggressively try to enforce the law, if you like, with legal action, then the ruling by the Supreme Court is basically meaningless. If you let everybody just ignore it, if you let organisations, if you let the London Marathon just break the law, then the ruling will be undermined to a catastrophic extent. So you guys are going to try and make sure that this law is now enforced.
Absolutely, for all levels, not just for elite, but for all levels. There's been so many sports that have copped out and just gone, right, we'll look after the elite and the rest of you we're not going to look after. And that's 99%, because the elite is only a very small number of people. But then you've got to get to being elite, haven't you? You've got to sort of go up through the ranks. And if it's ruining the pathways, how do we get elite? And things like the ECB were allowing fully grown men to bowl balls at 13-year-old girls. And we were there, we saw broken arms, and all sorts of different injuries. So yes, we will be fighting it without a shadow of a doubt. We will be fighting it. But also, I would very much like to try and go, how can we include everybody? Yeah. How can we make sure that everybody has an opportunity to do sport? I don't want anyone excluded from sport, because it's really important that we do physical activity and that, that everyone is involved. All I've ever wanted is it just to be fair.
Yeah, let's make sure that it's fair. That is the point. Sharon, it is always a privilege and a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. That was Olympic legend, women's rights campaigner Sharon Davis.